Hi, my name's Sarah Lovett. I'm a general paediatrician and I am the clinical lead for the ADHD Shared Care project, which has been rolled out over the last couple of years through the Hunter New England through H&E Kids. Tonight we're going to be talking about the benefits of the project to GPs in the local area and to the Hunter New England kids. The project is to try and increase the availability of paediatric outpatient department appointments for general paediatric patients to be reviewed. And it is by shifting some of the ADHD care load back to their GPs. Tonight should be able to help GPs feel more comfortable with managing ADHD and knowing how to access supports when they feel a little bit out of their depth. As far as the benefits to the local Hunter children is if we can shift some of the appointments of ADHD to be done with your GP, then we'll be able to open up spaces for new kids to be able to be seen by general paediatricians.
Hi, my name's Adam Grossel. I'm the ADHD Shared Care Coordinator. One of the other things you'll be learning about tonight is the benefits of this project and how it will benefit families. With Newcastle being such a widespread catchment in terms of the general paediatric outpatient department, being involved in this project means that families are able to be treated closer to home, which means they'll miss less time off school and less time off work.
It's wonderful to see faces in the real and on a computer screen for us, and be able to join together tonight to share a meal and to learn some exciting news around the ADHD shared care model. So thank you for joining us tonight. And it's not the best weather for driving, so drive safe when you leave tonight. I'd just like to start off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that we're meeting tonight, of the Warramai people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any of the First Nations people that might be joining us here tonight. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. So the bathrooms are directly out the door and just head straight ahead. If there's a fire, follow us. There's a door, there's a fire exit just on the right here, or there's another one straight ahead and another one down the hall. So hopefully we won't need those. Meals will be being served throughout the presentations tonight. So there's main meal and dessert will be being served, and that will occur during the presentations. Tonight we've got the pleasure of being joined by our LHD colleagues, our H&E LHD colleagues, and we thank them for their attendance tonight and sharing their project with us to help our local children. Also, I'd just like to also acknowledge the work and the collaboration between H&E, and it's been a great project to work on to point and to deliver tonight's session. So thanks to the H&E staff and also to our PHN staff. We've got Sarah Houlihan here. So Sarah's one of the primary care improvement officers. Also got Sandra and Marika up the back from the Health Pathways team. So any Health Pathways questions up the back, any primary care improvement or support questions to the front. I'd just like to welcome Abe to the lectern to present first tonight. So Abe's a local GP who'll be presenting first, and then we'll move on with the other presentations from there. So I'll just welcome Abe.
Thanks, Brendan. I must first thank Saren for these slides. She's put in a lot of work. Thank you, Saren, for that. Yeah. And I must say, I'm the lowest in the rung. So if you've got any questions directed to them, I can answer what I can. But you know, we all limited in our knowledge. Yeah. So I've learned a lot reading through these slides, and it's been an opening for me. All right. So for tonight's program, let's start with our journey when we consult as a GP. So we will be talking about Sally's ADHD journey, the parental concerns and the GP assessment, the referral pathways and how you can help, the pediatric assessment and the diagnosis, the ADHD medications and the ADHD plus, and the ADHD shared care, the new normal. So obviously, her journey starts at our GP center. We've got Sally, who's a 10-year-old girl who was a term baby, normal milestones. She was new to area from a defense family, quiet, average student at previous school in Townsville. She loves art and drawing, but has been very clumsy with sport. She's presenting to you in year 5. She's in mainstream school. Spelling and reading has been challenging for her. Gets easily distracted. She gets up and wanders around. Anxious and withdrawn socially and cannot follow multiple step instructions. She becomes, she's got a really bad refusal, in the morning, but I think that's quite common with our kids too, to go to school. Teacher reports increasing defiance with schoolwork. She left the class when asked to do writing task. She gives up easily in activities, can't ride bike yet. The mother can see a gap between Sally and her peers widening. Now you get into more history, you find that she's had recurrent ear infections as a toddler. She had an audiology done, which was normal, post-grommet at 4 years of age. She hates loud noises and busy places, and she finds it hard to settle at sleep. Lots of excuses at bedtime. But she sort of starts sleeping at around 9:30 and starts snoring. She eats a lot of carbohydrates, fruits, carrots, corn, chicken, and drinks 3 cups of Milo a day. Sounds like my child too. Her mother is a 35-year-old lady who's a wet nurse, generally well, finished year 10, finding it hard to read, has got a background history of anxiety, and has got a brother with ADHD. Father, who's of 37 years of age, works at the RAF base. He's generally well, an engineer, rigid and obsessive, has got a background of PTSD from active service. Sister is generally well. Brother, who's about 3 years of age, usually is on the go. Any thoughts? Question out there? Obviously it's ADHD, but anything else? Other than that? Iron deficiency, yep. Yep. Good. Sleep apnea. Any other thoughts? Obviously, we would think of about ODD or whether there's any language issues, intellectual disability, any thought disorders. If she's got any anxiety issues, depression, mood disorder. So there's a lot of thoughts going through our mind at the time when we consult this child with a family. So you've got parental concerns. They come to you to you as a GP. Then you've got the school concerns, and then you start the process of a PED referral. So the next question is, what can you do in parallel to help the family and the pediatrician? Now I start to hand over to Dr. Chris. Thanks.
Thanks, Abe. So hi everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Chris Badler and I'm a pediatrician out of the John Hunter. So how to get to the pediatrician and what to do while you wait. So I can fill 2 years apparently. That was my only waitlist joke. But really, what can we do for Sally from a basic point of view? And I suppose what I wanted to talk a little bit about, what can be done while she waits to see us and what can make our job together easier and how can we improve Sally's life. I think it's really important to focus on many of the potential medical issues that have come up for Sally and come up for a lot of children. And it really is often about many of the basics. So so many kids have recurrent otitis media and hearing issues and it's just not picked up. So ensuring that ears and hearing assessment is appropriate. If you're not hearing properly, you're not going to be able to pay attention at school and things are going to go south a lot quicker. Sleep hygiene are 2 words we love using, and it's easier said than done. we all recognise the increasing introduction of screen time, and also how I suppose routines in a family home can be different and challenging for sleep. It's tempting to grab to something we can prescribe or even at least take by mouth to see if it improves things. But yes, we can use melatonin, but I think it's a big plug for continue harping on about sleep routines in the house. And one of my mentors always talked about melatonin being a great placebo while we let sleep hygiene and routines come into place. So yes, there's definitely something to be said for melatonin, but it's not everything and it's not going to work forever. But it certainly can be trialed to see if that can help things click into gear. I think someone already mentioned potential sleep apnea, and it's important to recognise. And the common thing would be an obstructive cause in children, so thinking about ENTs or at least nose and throat in terms of tonsils as well as adenoids. And diet, I agree my kids as well would like to have, or often not would like to have, may have 3 glasses of Milo a day. And it's not just about Milo, but it is about sugar intake. And we all know that sugar is a great fuel, particularly for little brains, and too much of it will keep them going in overdrive. So how can we optimize the really basic things in a child's life? And it's a lot of these things that we also attack when we see the children. With hearing goes vision as well. And it's important just to make sure that the vision is checked. And I find that commonly the kids that we see, all this has been done already, of course, but it's really important. This is not, the next point about baseline and nutritional bloods is not to say that, at least me personally, I wouldn't necessarily like every child that we get to see to have baseline bloods. But someone mentioned iron deficiency in the middle of diet, and iron deficiency is a typical, is a common thing and a common dietary cause of fatigue, which would lead to possibly not paying as good attention. So it is important to think about, and probably the sneaky thyroid in there as well is also important to think about. A lot of these things can often be picked out clinically and on a good history, and you don't always have to go to bloods, and certainly we wouldn't expect every child to be referred to have nutritional bloods, but it's something to keep in mind. And to go into further vitamins, they're sort of the vitamins and I suppose micronutrients, including zinc, that we often would do, but not again, would be necessarily required. And I think iron and thyroid with a full blood count would be, if anything, what would be indicated. The next 2 points are about school, and in any referral, in any child's life, school is our friend. And there's lots of useful information we can get from school, and it's not necessarily about rating scales, which I will touch on shortly. It's just about the regular school reports, and there's lots to read through, but usually for those of you who have children, at the very end there's a general comment, and that's usually where it comes out, whether there's any trouble. It's not impossible to have ADHD without it being noticed at school, but I would say it's probably rarer, and it is really useful to get a comment from school. And NAPLAN is also a good indicator of where the child sits academically. This is just an outline of a NAPLAN score. For those who have seen them before, the black dots are where the index child or the current child sits. The white dots, the white arrows, are the school average, and the black dots are the national average. And for Sally, you can see that particularly reading is a problem. So her black dot is well below where we'd expect it to be, whilst everything else, writing sits about above the national average and about the school average. She's a bit below on conventions of language, and numeracy she's also a little bit behind, but particularly reading stands out as something that she struggles with. Now, what about rating scales for assessments? I think this is a bit of a busy slide, and I think the main thing I want to hit home with 3 things, well, probably 4 things. The middle column here are the free online ADHD questionnaires that are available for anyone online. So you can Google either the SNAP 4 or the Vanderbilt, and you'll find a really easy questionnaire online. They're named after the people that created them. Essentially, they're both American, or the Vanderbilt group, and then the SNAP stands for the few names that have created them. the three things that are really important, I think, about questionnaires is number one, they're indicative, they're not diagnostic. So just a questionnaire doesn't mean a diagnosis, but it's helpful. The second thing I would say is that there are age ranges for these questionnaires. So if you have a rowdy 3-year-old that's busy, there's no point in applying these questionnaires because they're based on ages 6 and above. So it really is school age and above for these questionnaires. Most 3-year-olds will have ADHD on any of these questionnaires, right? Actually, all 3-year-olds, just about. And I think the last thing is it's good to get a parent to fill in a questionnaire, but you already have the parent there telling you their problems. The best thing is getting school or the teacher to fill one in. So ADHD by definition and diagnosis needs to be seen in more than one area of life, and school is the typical one. So if we can get one from the school and include that even in the referral, brilliant. The work is nearly already done. The other questionnaires here on the left are the ones that we do have some of them, and psychologists typically have some of them, and school counsellors have them. School counsellors do have them, but as we probably most of us know, school counsellors are spread quite thinly in the public system, unfortunately, and they sort of deal with the ones that are really, the children that are really problematic. Connors and the CBRS is also a Connors-based scale, and the CBRS is a behavioural rating scale that is a bit more extensive than just ADHD. Connors 3 is a bit more specific for ADHD. Achenbach or the ACEBAs are also sort of general a bit across emotional. Abe mentioned in the differentials about IQ or cognitive assessments. And in children that struggle at school, the tricky ones, they get picked up by school counsellors and have cognitive assessments. Not everyone needs to have a cognitive assessment, particularly if there are big struggles at school, it's really, really useful. And then there's some other assessments that I've talked a lot to this slide already, so I was going to skim through it. But certainly the message is that it's not just about questionnaires for ADHD. I think about other things like language, like functional abilities, and these things can often be assessed by occupational therapists, speech pathologists, who are excellent at finding strategies to try to manage some of it. The key again, or the difficulty probably again, is just about to access them for at least probably a larger part of the population that we see, at least through the hospital. I probably don't need to tell you about referral pathways. You probably know more than I do. This is obviously through to the public system to eRIMS. You know, there are multiple pathways, all great ways lead to Rome. But I think it's a good plug for health pathways and SENT, as well as the central intake form that has been developed that can provide intake into various services through H&E, kids health at least. And again, through community health pathways or health pathways, where community health pathways has the ADHD pathway. There's lots of good information, and pretty much all of I say today will be in there. This is our central intake form that we developed. Most of you might be familiar with that as well, and it does also come electronically. I think just up in the, you can't see my arrow, but up in the black square there, it tells you that this is a central intake now for our area. That does not include Maitland, but putting the details on this form enables it to potentially forward it to teams like the Child Development Team, which is a multidisciplinary developmental assessment team at Wallsend, as well as the Youth Health Team. And it only goes to Kate, so it's really great for us. You know, what other supports are possible? Again, it's about access, and we all recognize that probably in our area we don't have as good an access as we want. But I mentioned a little bit our allied health colleagues that can help immensely in part of a child's development. And I think it's a good plug to say that behavior is really just part of development for a child. And just as speech, your behavior can be delayed, and it's multifactorial. You know, occupational therapists, again, are magicians in how they can help children regulate their emotions and thus improve their function. Obviously, there are behavioral therapists and psychologists out there. that are really, in the context of ADHD, are the prime, what we try to target in under 6s if we can without medication. There's lots of other information there, including parental education and parental groups. And without speaking too much to this, to all the ones that are out there, resourcingparents.newsouthwales.gov.au is a good common resource online to find what could be available in local districts. But particularly the top right one, triple P, is a common one, and the bottom left, circle of security, which you might be familiar with. And it's really about parents being more aware of what is normal for a child, what might be abnormal, and why children might behave like that, and respond in a more suitable way to their child. And I think all parents, including myself, would benefit from this. So, you know, for the pediatric review, the GP referral was fantastic, and we had lots of the medical family history that you heard Abe present already. We did have some investigation reports. We even had some information from school. So what was done for Sally? She tried some nasal steroids, and that must have improved her nasal airflow and decreased her adenoids because her snoring improved. She did try melatonin at 2 milligrams, and now she's able to click into sleep at around 8 p.m. She's still anxious and refusing to go to school, and we can still wonder why that is. Is it just because of her learning, or is it multifactorial? And unfortunately, at school now, she's not completing her work, and that leads to some repercussions, which causes a bit of a negative circle. The investigations that we did find was that most things were normal on her bloods, but Dr. A picked up that her ferritin was 18 and was a bit concerned about that being in the deficient range, so he commenced her on some oral iron at a rough maintenance dose. Vitamin D was in the moderate deficiency range at 24, and she was commenced on 3 months of vitamin D. And just to make sure, he chucked in a multivitamin as well, which I don't think hurts anyone anytime. Luckily, her hearing was normal. What do we get from the school counsellor report? I wasn't very familiar with cognitive assessments until I finished my training, and unfortunately then I got thrown into it. So I've learned a lot since then. I've been lucky to talk to quite a few psychologists who know much more than me. But essentially, when you get a WISC is a common cognitive assessment, and it's basically an IQ assessment. It gives you a FSIQ, which is in top darker blue, which is a full scale IQ, which is basically your IQ score. That's based on 5 different sub-scores, which you can see here. And you can see for Sally there was a discrepancy where her processing speed and working memory was relatively quite a lot poorer than the other sub-scales for her. And it's not diagnostic, I wouldn't say, but it's certainly something we commonly see in children with ADHD, or people with ADHD, that your processing speed and working memory might be suffering compared to everything else that you're functioning. So she's not in a disability range at all in terms of her total score, but we can see that there are discrepancies. And normally, if the school counsellor does this, I will add, there is ideally a comment about how they've interpreted it, because they're really much better than us at interpreting it. There was a CONUS 3 done through school, and this, I will just make up saying that's a teacher report. Again, the CONUS is an electronic questionnaire now, just for your information, and it blurts out about 17 pages. This is page 3, so that's usually the most visually pleasing for me at least. And it gives some scales here. You can see that hyperactivity, impulsivity is high up there, inattention also up there, and a few other issues around learning and executive function, peer relations. Really, any score above 60 is really quite relevant, and any score above 70 sort of signifies a moderate to severe issue. Probably more interesting really are what are the free scales that are out there show. She had a SNAP 4 result as well, where you can see that this is a SNAP questionnaire. It divides some questionnaires into inattentive and then hyperactive, impulsive. And really the answers is really not at all, just a little bit, quite a lot, or very much all the time. And Sally's scores were quite up there, both in inattentive and hyperactive impulsive subtypes. And a lot of these questions are based on the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, which is through the DSM-5 criteria that we generally use, where you need to have 6 out of 9 scores present for either or. So based on this, for Sally, going through, when we have quite a lot of comprehensive information, we know that she still struggles at school despite addressing a lot of some of the medical issues, the iron deficiency. We talked about the sleep. She still struggles. She still has that inattentive and hyperactive components of her of ADHD. She does meet the criteria for combined subtype of ADHD. There's absolutely, oops, sorry. Oh, sorry, Stephen. I'm stealing your show. There are definitely some learning problems there that light up in the corners, which again aren't diagnostic, but indicative that there might be something else. So thinking about, do we think about a SLD, specific learning disorder in writing or reading, specific learning disorder in reading, formerly or better known as dyslexia, writing dysgraphia. But I think it's important then to talk through, and that's not part of what we do as well, what is ADHD? How do you meet the criteria? Does it mean that you're a naughty kid? No, it doesn't. It means that you've got troubles concentrating or with hyperactivity. And what can be offered from a therapeutic point of view. So I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Stephen Knipe, who's one of our colleagues.
Hello, everyone. Stephen Knipe. I'm one of the pediatricians. All of a sudden, I've got palpitations and need a wee. So if I run out, that's what's happening. The other thing is I've got my glasses here. I just turned mid-40s, and so I'm not sure what to look at. So if I'm off and on, that's what's happening. I'll just take a little spot to thank Sarah and Adam for putting this together. We get to stand up here for ages and sound really intelligent, but actually they've put a whole heap of work in. So if I don't get a chance to thank them in public later, today's the, oh no. All right. So Sally starts her ADHD medication. This is something we would do pretty commonly, and I think the number of letters that I send out with ADHD medication on them, I suspect that a lot of you will know quite a lot of this anyway, so I apologize in advance if I'm going over some things that you're already very familiar with. But it's nice to know that you're doing the right thing, I suppose. So this is a bit of a table talking about one of the classes of medications that we use in ADHD. It's by far the most common class of prescribed medications, the psychostimulant medications. Really just two broad classes, the methylphenidate side of it and the dexamphetamine side of it. And each of those then, those subgroups, tell us whether they're short-acting preparations or long-acting preparations. So the letters that you'll get back from us will have a variety of most of those, but probably most of them will be that top right orange color there. That's my practice, certainly, is those ones. So we'll talk about some of those in a bit more detail, but actually the effects that they have, pretty wide-ranging actually. When you think about how severely dysfunctional some of the children with ADHD and associated comorbidities are, we find that we generally get quite a lot of bang for our buck when we prescribe psychostimulant medications if they're well enough tolerated. And just while I'm rabbiting on, you're probably having a bit of a look through some of those symptoms, and really when you're looking through those symptoms, it just sounds like somebody who's got a pretty good going ADHD. And we would usually list quite a few of those symptoms in our counselling sessions with the families prior to starting them on the psychostimulant medication. Definitely those top 3 on the left and the top 1 on the right is very, very much improved. And when you get improvements for the rest of those on the left and the right, you end up with some kids have a complete turnaround in their presentation and their ability to focus, concentrate, and thrive in a previously challenging environment for them. So it's not all roses, unfortunately. We do get a few side effects, and I'm sure you're pretty aware of most of those. The ones that we would see most commonly: appetite suppression with resultant weight loss. We would pretty much tell the families to expect a weight loss of a couple of kilos even. We'd show them on the growth charts and we'd tell them where they are now and where we expect them to end up. And then we would also talk to them about the other common side effect is sleep onset delays. So prolonged sleep latency at night, they have difficulty getting to sleep. We don't see that probably as much if we are quite careful about our prescriptions. I had somebody that was lost to follow-up. They'd moved to Tamworth. When they rang, they said, it wasn't working, just that single dose in the morning, so I added the other one at night. I was like, right, how's he going? I can't get him to sleep. I was like, okay. So that does happen from time to time. And today I had a telephone call with somebody, and their child was on a very low dose of short-acting Ritalin, only half a tablet in the morning and half a tablet at 11:30 in the morning. His sleep onset had increased by about 2 hours. So it does happen, and some people seem to be a bit more sensitive, even when you would expect the medication to have left the system by that stage. I often talk to them about transient side effects, nausea, headache, very common. Sometimes we need to give them a little bit of paracetamol, but most often not. With increased emotions, I talk to them about increased teariness. Just trivial things upset the children. They become upset, especially on pickup from school, and have a lot of difficulty settling. The anxiety, it's interesting because it came through as an improved function in the previous slide, and that's what we usually say, but we know that maybe 5 to 10% of kids will develop anxiety or worsen existing anxiety when we start the medication. So always on the lookout for that, because families don't always expect that. Having said that, I usually tell the families with anxiety, if they can give it a few weeks, even up to 6 or 8 weeks, sometimes that'll settle. But if you're creating a child who's worse after a trial of medication compared to before, it's a deal breaker. And if you have somebody where you're giving them anxiety, then you're either changing the dose, changing the preparation, or abandoning that psychostimulant plan. Some of those uncommon ones, I'd say I really don't see very many of them. Really, the tics is probably the only one. I'd get 2 or 3 a year of them. And my approach, I'm not sure about the other pediatricians, is to treat it like a tic disorder, find out how much dysfunction it's causing within the child's life, and whether there's anything specific that might otherwise have brought on the tic that we can address. And sometimes, not uncommonly, you can manage those tics and the children don't really mind too much, and they've got very supportive schools and peer groups, and they just manage and they get a much better benefit from their concentration and attention that you're able to manage the tics all right. Right, so on to the specifics of the medicines. That first one's methylphenidate. Whenever we're doing our writing, we talk as being MPH for methylphenidate. And this was my first learning point, looking through these slides that Sarah put together. I'd forgotten that this was how it works. So it blocks the reuptake of dopamine, noradrenaline, increasing those levels at the synapse, and that's thought to improve the concentration and focus of the children. Our baseline dose that we have in our head as a kind of a anchor, if you like, is 1 milligram per kilo per day, but we often vary on either side of that to a certain extent, probably, and most families would agree that you'd want to start on the lower side and end up lower if you can, but none of us have got any worries whatsoever about safely putting somebody on 1 milligram per kilogram per day. We've all seen children with autism have a lot of those side effects on the previous slide. When we're starting on standard dosing for ADHD. And so when we're commencing people with autism, we're very careful to counsel them about expected side effects and about how low and how slow we want to start those medicines. So pretty basic stuff. The guys that allow us to prescribe out of Canberra, they safely allow us to prescribe 2 milligrams per kilogram per day. That's a big dose. And if I had somebody approaching that dose, I'd be looking at what else is going on in that child's life. And I'd be wanting to try and have a big look at what's going on in their home situation, what's happening at school, and whether or not there's anything there that we can really go back. I'd be redoing the history on that one. So Ritalin short-acting is what we start the children on. It's very most commonly started. I'd say it's like 95%. Yep. We all start on Ritalin short-acting. It's pretty good. It gives us a little bit of flexibility because it's got a short half-life. Means that we can work out how many milligrams per day they're needing to use before we switch over to a long-acting medicine. We counsel that it's given after breakfast and after a break at school, whether it's recess or lunch, so they can have the food. I actually tell my families, don't actually worry if they don't eat food at school at all. Concentrate on the breakfast and the dinner and the weekends and school holidays if they're not having the medicines at the weekends and school holidays. Learning point number 2 for me, I have not had a child with ADHD and celiac disease. And now, if I do, I'll know to tell them there's gluten in the Ritalin. Sarah learned it the hard way, so there you go. All right, so the younger kids in primary school, often they need a couple of doses. Some of us will just give the first dose to see if there's an improvement and then change up and decide to give a second dose at school or change them to a long-acting at that point. Sometimes the flexibility is excellent for the children and the schools are really good at giving the medicine and they'll give it through the day, but then they get home, they might have a little touch of homework or after-school activity or after-school therapy with allied health. Half a dose after school is often pretty useful at that stage, bearing in mind that if they are slow metabolizers or it's in the system when they get to bed, you have to look out for the prolonged sleep latency. And also, if they're really big dinner eaters and you're giving them some before dinner, you have to watch out for that as well. We weigh them so often, we're always pretty close to looking at that anyhow. Right, Ritalin LA, 10, 20, 30, 40, and most recently over the last couple of years, they got the 60 into, which is really good because we used to usually only use these in primary school kids that were smaller. With the 60 there, it gives us a bit more opportunity to give it into the bigger kids that are into high school. Pretty good, onset pretty early. As it says there, it's a little capsule. And in fact, when you open the capsule, there's little sprinkles inside. Half of those sprinkles are just like immediate release Ritalin. The other half will be enteric coated and they release their payload of Ritalin or MPH over the sort of 6 to 8 hours. There are a lot of kids that seem to say to us it's wearing off at 2, 3 o'clock and you just kind of throw your hands up and try and work your way around that. There are a few kids that might be on a modest dose of Ritalin LA in the morning and then we actually give them a short-acting dose at the end of the day to get them through that sort of 3 o'clock till 5 o'clock time period. We have often seen, I don't know about the rest of you, but one of my experiences with the Ritalin LA compared to some of the other longer-acting ones is that whenever the medicine disappears from their bloodstream at around 3 o'clock, it coincides with their parents picking them up. They've held things together through school like kids do, and then they just totally unload, full of ADHD and defiance as they get into the car, and then the parents are trying not to crash the car. And so that's when the parents say, okay, we need a bit of a different aspect. So we see that a bit more in the Ritalin LA than we do, or I do in the Concerta and the Vyvanse, which is one of the other longer-acting medications. All right, so the kids that can't swallow, and I don't know, I wish I had a magic bullet for shooting kids, actually. And when I shoot them with my magic bullet, they learn how to swallow tablets. Oh my goodness, honestly, they should be taught as soon as they're onto solids, right, forget the X, you're getting a tablet. All right, okay, enough of that. Beads, sprinkle them on food, they can swallow them pretty good. And same can be said for the short-acting Ritalin. It's not beads, but it can be crushed and manipulated in heaps different ways, so they'll be able to swallow it pretty well. We don't tend to get too many compliance problems from a swallowing perspective with the Ritalin or the Ritalin LA. Same cannot be said for Concerta. It's a capsule and it cannot be cut. It cannot be crushed, it can't be crumbled, and it can't be dissolved. So you have to have swallowing children for that, and you can't divide your doses up either with the same tablet. You can only manipulate the dose if you add different strengths of tablets together, which we would see most commonly between that 36 and that 54 milligram, because those kids tend to be in year 5, year 6. It's a pain in the neck because they're not concentrating enough on the 34, but they're only 45 kilos. And you're going, 54 is a big hike for this kid who's already running along the lower percentiles. So what we sometimes do, although it's a double cost prescription for the families, is combine the 18 and the 27 together. So Concerta usually works really well. It's a very good one for late primary school and high school children. It's probably the most common long-acting one that we would prescribe across the course of the child's ADHD journey. As it says there, there's a smaller percentage of it as the outer coating, immediate release, and then the inside is the osmotic release where the tablet releases it gradually. And I have never seen a Concerta in the toilet. I'm sure they would have shown me a picture of it because people have shown me pictures of poos in toilets. Have you, right? So that's another new thing for me to learn. Now, dexamphetamine This increases neurotransmission, dopamine, noradrenaline again. It's a bit, I equate the dexamphetamine to the short-acting version of Ritalin. So again, short half-life, multiple doses through the day, and you can divide that last dose into a little bit of a half dose for the younger kids. Some of the bigger kids that for whatever reason you need that flexibility of dexamphetamine, they might be on a full dose after school as well, and that's usually the older teenagers. I do have quite a few older teenagers that are on it. It seems to be excellent as a pure activity, hyperactive, fidgety, concentration, smash and grab. You want to treat your ADHD, short-acting dexamphetamine's excellent for it. Comes with a bit more harsh side effects, unfortunately, so you have to have a child that's going to tolerate it. Quick onset, short duration. Dose range is about 0.5 milligrams. So the doses are half what you'd get in the Ritalin. But if you're talking tablets, it's usually the same number of tablets as you'd go from a Ritalin one. So the long-acting one, dexamphetamine, is Vyvanse. You've probably heard of that. And that's been around, how long now? 5 years maybe? Longer? Maybe 8, something like that. And it landed with a lot of pharmaceutical fanfare and a lot of marketing, and quite a lot of pediatricians took to it pretty well. And we've been learning how to use it over the last 5 to 8 years or so. Again, because it's a dexamphetamine-based medicine and it's long-active, again, it's very good for the kids that are really hyperactive. They've got quite a bit of conduct disorder as associated, or behavioral disorder associated with their ADHD. It is quite harsh on those side effects, the appetite suppression, lots of variability in the capsule sizes. And so we used to just have the 3 doses of 30, 50, and the 70, but a couple of years ago they introduced the even numbers too. And it has a maximum dose there of 70. I'd only have a handful of kids on that maximum dose. And of course, because it's the long-acting, it's a lisdexamphetamine, it doesn't have the same action as the dexamphetamine immediately, so it doesn't have that abuse potential on it. So I think we do prescribe a few non-stimulants, and we've got a slide on the non-stimulants as well. Probably the one that you'd see most commonly on the children coming back from our clinics would be the clonidine or the catapress, which is a medicine that originally used by the cardiologist to lower the blood pressure. And we use it with children who have a bit more comorbid behavioral problems with verbal or aggressive outbursts, whose conduct in school is causing detentions, multiple behavioral incident report forms, and perhaps even the threat of expulsion. If that school is otherwise a good fit for that child, then it's worthwhile certainly looking at that aggressive side of things. And we would use catapress on its own for ADHD, pure ADHD symptoms. It's not quite as good or anywhere near as good for focus, attention, concentration, distractibility as the psychostimulant medications are. Nonetheless, it can be a little bit of a bridging medicine for those really aggressive 5-year-olds, 4 or 5-year-olds. Maybe whilst we're working them up, we can start them on a very small dose of catapress, and we can buy some time within their educational establishment whilst we get the rest of the workup finished and start them on a psychostimulant, if that's the way that we're going to end up going. Inchinev's been out for a couple of years now. It's been out in America for a lot longer. It's basically a long-acting form of clonidine without just as much drowsiness, whereas the clonidine will send kids to sleep. You'll get multiple reports of them falling asleep in school, which is a bad thing, by the way. That's something that would cause us to reduce the dose or change the medicine. The guanfacine's not quite as bad for the tiredness. So it's been around, and we've been using that as a standalone medicine in ADHD for people that are contraindicated for the ADHD medications. And those children then might have some degree of improved behavior and less impulsive behavior in the school situation. So there's 1 or 2 along the way that we would maybe trial guanfacine as a second-line ADHD medicine. Atomoxetine would be a much more common second-line medication. It's goes by the brand name Strattera, and it comes from the antidepressive line of medications. And as such, whilst it's probably about 30, 40, 50% as good as the psychostimulants for its attentional properties and its concentration properties, it's actually got a really good anti-anxiety or antidepressive side effects. So if you do have a child who has comorbid generalized anxiety or social anxiety or any of the subtypes of anxiety, it's often a very good mix for them. I generally don't start it as a first line, even if the child has got anxiety problems, because often when we start them on the psychostimulant medication and all of a sudden they're fitting in within their class, the anxiety drops away. But if you have kids who've got persistent anxiety, they're losing weight on the medicine, then atomoxetine might be a good fit for them. So start low, go slow. This is fairly common starting regime. If you have a child who's much bigger, late primary school, early high school, when they're starting, they may start on a bit higher dose. Once they're kind of used to the medicines, they can often start straight in at their starting dose or not. Probably about half of the children that I have, well, with this table, what we say to people is that if you actually get a really good result and you're on week 2, just stay at week 2. There's no point in going up to the goal dose if things are going really well beforehand, because you're really just going to expose them to a higher chance of side effects without getting the required extra benefit. So sometimes for the kids that are in early primary school, we would go 10 milligrams in the morning and then 5 milligrams at lunch, because the afternoon period of early primary school is more sport-based or art-based or excursion-based, less of the mathematics and less of the reading literacy. So often we would sit at that one if we're not going to a long-acting medication. And then the review to 6 to 8 weeks, if you're lucky. Often it's kind of like, email me or send me a phone call or... So, best practice. This is best practice, yeah. So, stimulant therapy goals, really, you look at those straight down the line ADHD minus the comorbid factors that Kate's going to talk about. And the psychostimulant medication will address and give a significant improvement to pretty much all of them. And in fact, if I have somebody, and in my, from the referral, from the documents that come with the referral, from the history and the examination, and the overall assessment, if it's looking like a pure ADHD, I usually say to the families, you got a greater than 95% chance of this child having a significant and sustained improvement with the medication, as long as they remain in a stable home and educational environment. It's really, really good, and it does get quite a bad press with the families. So we usually spend quite a bit of time going through why you would start medication. We didn't have a slide on it, but my own counselling with families about discussing when to go on medicines, because nobody wants to put their kids on medicine. I say, well, first of all, we need to be able to have an indication for it, so we need to have a workup and a diagnosis. And if the workup and the diagnosis is there, then if the function of the child with those diagnoses is good, then nobody's going to put that child on medicine. The paediatrician won't want to, the teachers won't see the requirement for it, and the families won't need to. But it doesn't take much for them to drop their function. And I say that if they're dropping their academic standards below where they're expecting, or they're diverging away from where they're needing to go, if their anxiety is or other mental health disorder is rising as they get older with their ADHD, and they're becoming much worse with their self-esteem and self-worth, or if they have a significant level of disruption such that it's threatening their place in school, and that place in school, and there's not a great other option for them to go to, or fourthly, their ADHD symptomatology is interfering with either their social activities or it's interfering with their allied health benefits, then something needs to be done. And usually once the families see some of those areas over the course of a number of months, they'll come to the party and they'll say, it's the very last thing we need to do and this is what we'll have to do. And we go, okay, fine, there you go. So, all right. Dry mouth. That's all right. I'm going well. Don't worry. I've only got 75 more slides to go. So, assessing response to stimulants. We get them back when we can, or we get an email, or we have a phone call, or some way we make contact with them, or we lose them to follow up and find out whenever they've run out of script 6 months later how things went. But ideally, we'll get them in. The parents will let you know, oh my God, it was amazing. I can't believe it. They're a completely different person. It's brilliant. And I still, after 10 years of doing this, I still get a warm, fuzzy feeling in my chest when I hear them say that. And I get a really warm, fuzzy feeling when I hear the teachers write us a note saying this is bloody, well, they don't use the B word, but they say this is awesome and it's really good. So I usually say to the families, we have to have this short-term improvement where we can see that there's an improvement in concentration. We can see there's an improvement in your attention and your focus, but that's not the be-all and end-all. We want the improvement in function. So we want the kids to actually start to improve their social networking in school. We want them to be able to look at the teacher and learn and absorb the material that's being given to them, so that'll be reflected in their end of school report. We want their therapists to relay back to us that things have improved. And we want their social life, so things like whether it's scouts or it's drama or it's sports or a combination of all three, that's all working as well. So we kind of gather all that stuff in the interview, and it's really nice to get something back from the teachers. We have a few ways that we try and get the teachers to feed back to us a bit more formally, because it's be nice if the PBS rang us up and said, you've had this kid on medicine, is it working? And they don't do that, they don't have enough time. But I usually say to the families, for me to continue prescribing, I need to have some documentation formally that this is working. So we do usually send out some mini questionnaires like the SNAP 18 or the Vanderbilt. Right, so my actual one I use, and I should have mentioned it to you, I don't know if anyone else does, the SNAP one I've been using for quite a number of years. It's a 90-page questionnaire, and the last 10 questions are only for the teachers. The parents don't complete that one, and those last 10 questions have got their own little name. They're called a SCAMP, S-K-A-M-P. And what I do is I send the SCAMP questionnaire out to the teachers after the trial of medication, and it's really just about how the kids starting classroom assignments, whether they've got task completion, what their interactions are like with peers or with teachers. Very, very quick to complete. I compare it to the teacher's original SNAP, where they had the last questionnaires beforehand, and there you've got it, so it's all okay. But actually we use a variety of tools. Sally had her SNAP 4, this is her 18. And you can see maybe from memory from the last one. I'm not going to bother going back to the other one. Just believe us when we say it's a whole lot better than the last one. We do change the medication, and you'll be involved in some of this on the SCA. And the medications really, as the kids grow and they put on weight, they'll outgrow their dose. They'll have breakthrough ADHD symptoms, which are similar to the ones that they had prior to going onto the medication altogether. There will be a few other indicators, such as their deportment, whether they're a bit more disruptive, whether they've started to put on a whole heap of weight. Sometimes you go, hold on a minute, 4 kilos in 6 months? What's going on there? You'll change the dose and make them skinny again. So you get a bit more emotional regulation, the family dynamics. So you usually go off in the house and people start knitting at each other and getting at each other again. And then you'll start to see a bit more of some of those comorbid symptoms that they had might come through, like anxiety or like physical or verbal aggression come through again. So we might reduce the dose if you've got side effects, really, I guess. And probably the main one and the most frustrating one for us is crossing those percentiles. We obviously tolerate a drop in a percentile, maybe even 2 on occasion if it's having a really good go and they had a good baseline. But if you're sort of a year, 2 years down the line, they're still crossing percentiles, then you're talking to the families about reducing the dose, giving them longer holidays, taking them off weekends, and making sure that you have got as many calories going into their drug-free days as possible. So we do quite a lot of work around them on that. Often we'll ask if they can see a dietitian with a food diary, if we can get them in to see one. I've stopped the medication or dropped the medication for the anxiety that I was mentioning before, and then some of those intolerable side effects. And when I've started children on trials of medication, I say, look, I'm a bit of a guide here. Yes, I've done this heaps before, and I know a lot about what's going to happen. But this is your child, it's your trial, you're taking them home, you're the one that's in charge of the medication. And if you feel like you're having an absolutely intolerable side effect and you don't even have time to hear back from me, then just stop the medicine and we can talk about it down the line. People ask me about the zombie kids, and that's really worth mentioning because every time, there's probably a rotation of about 18 months before a current affair or today, tonight, pick up the zombie kid line on ADHD. I have seen that. I'm sure you guys have as well. Not very much, maybe 2 or 3 kids. And when you delve deep into it, it's often been children who have come from quite a dysfunctional family that have been highly affected with psychosocial, and they've been getting extra medication. And they have been very quiet, and they've been not interacting very much at all. And it's quite sad whenever that comes to your attention, and we rely on teachers a lot to give us that sort of feedback in our post-trial medication. We sometimes get a hold of it whenever the medication runs out before time, and the kids have been given extra to drop their, if any attention for the family is too much for those some of those families have got other priorities in their life. So we see that, and the other time we would see the flat affect is polypharmacy. So if they're on psychiatric medications and they're on depressive medications, or something like clonidine would feed into that as well. So you just have to sort of take it back a step, look at it, and absolutely, if you do have a child that's a zombie child, I use the word zombie children to the families because that's what they're thinking anyway, then we act pretty quickly to sort of address it and adjust things. Right, okay. So, so with that task avoidance, impulsive behavior, risk-taking, we look at this as a reason to sort of think about changing the medication. Often you sort of go, oh, okay, the teachers have written me a big long letter, it's 2 pages. The kid's got an incident report form that's 14 pages over the last 3 months. Obviously this medicine's not working, but you look at it and you go, hold on a minute, that's like 1.2 milligrams per kilogram per day. The child hasn't been putting on weight. They're on really good dose, and you look back and you go, hold on, there's more to this family. We need to think about other triggers that might be causing this. Has something happened with a separation? Do they go to see the other parent, who's the other custody parent, who hasn't got the same discipline regime? Is that something that we need to think about? You need to think about all of those things, I guess. And then if they are able to, and you can sometimes go up to that next dose if you need to. But it's quite difficult because we look at these kids who come in with these long lists, and sometimes it's dead obvious. It's all ADHD, and you go, okay, you're up on a dose. But other times it's like, no, it's more disruption. It's more anxiety. It's more cyclical whenever they go to the other person's family. It only ever happens whenever they finish school holidays, and it takes them 3 weeks to settle back into school. So you just have to ask a few more questions around the timing and the environment and what else is going on. Weight loss. So, yep, 2 to 4 kilos. I talk about the J curve with the kids. They come in, they have their medication. I'll try and do it backwards for you. They have the medication, and then we put them on medicine, then they drop, and then they drop to the next percentile, and then they increase. And so it kind of looks like a J on our percentile graph. We often say that with the medication weight loss, that it will gain weight, and that you can expect that the previously having had a height centile being the same as the weight centile, it'll now be a discrepancy, and your child will look skinnier, and your child will look like they've got ribs, but it doesn't mean that they're malnourished. Now, one little caveat to that, which I've kind of learned through experience, and I'm not sure if my colleagues are the same, but I've found that obese kids do not lose weight. Because you say to them, this is a weight loss drug, it appetite suppresses, it's great, but the medicine wears off in the evening, and they binge eat. And they eat higher amounts of calories, and they eat bigger portions whenever the medicine's not in the system. So not every child, but a significant number of the obese children that go onto psychostimulant medication don't have the weight loss effect we're secretly hoping for. And so you still need to do the weight loss lifestyle changes for those kids and not rely on medication as a weight loss adjuvant. So these are some of the things that we use to try and improve weight. And we go back to working out whether or not actually they're restrictive eating on the medicine. If it's already on a previously restrictive diet, puts them at even higher risk of macronutrient deficiency, and so we would redo those bloods if we hadn't already done them. So we talk about the time outside of school as being a time for children to thrive in other areas, and we note that my thoughts are that ADHD medicine is first and foremost medicine that is given in school to assist the children's educational and social development with their peer group. Now, having said that, sometimes the burden of ADHD is so high that you do all that good work in school and then they get home and their presentation, their behavior, their conduct is such that all that good work and the awards they've been getting at school is all undone within a few hours with frustrated, low tolerance parents that have had enough of their child. And so we have to do quite a bit of counselling through our clinics about how the families are coping with the children outside of the ADHD time. Just that little point at the bottom we've already touched on. Anxiety is quite a big thing. We touched on that before, mentioned that a lot of kids actually improve their anxiety if it's in the right sort of anxiety. And I would always mention anxiety as either being something that will get better or something that will get worse. Mentioned at the bottom there a switch to atomoxetine if we really can't manage the anxiety on psychostimulant medications. And then I guess probably one or two. This is pretty rare for me in the context of psychostimulant medication, unless there's a comorbid anxiety, depression, and there's a lot more going on. Obviously, that becomes a bit more important. But basically, I'll go through all of the self-harm, suicidal ideation questions outside of ADHD and then come back to the ADHD and work out. If I can't come up with something else, I'll think about ADHD being implicated in that. It's quite difficult because if you take them off their ADHD medication, then they're likely to become much more dysregulated and they'll lose a lot of that routine that's been holding them together. And so it's quite a big choice to come off that. If you've just put them on the medication and they're having all these thoughts, then it makes it a lot easier. But if they've been on the medicine for a while and it's a stable environment and this happens, then we have to sort of go through from a little bit like scratch. Right, so if they do have the self-harm, then we would consider stopping that medicine. The option is then to switch out to an atomoxetine type medication, referring through our mental health pathways if we need to, discussing with us about what we might or might not do. And there's not an insignificant number of children who have ADHD plus, and that might include anxiety disorders, and they would then be on medication, antidepressive medication, like an SSRI or some sort. That's me. I've quite enjoyed myself. I like talking to myself. Do it for a bit longer. But Kate's going to come up and talk about some morbid conditions. Are we keeping questions till the end? Questions at the end, because Saren's the top of the tree here. She knows all the answers.
The tall and the short of it. I think you did this in height order, didn't you? So I'm Kate Thompson-Bowe. I'm a general paediatrician. I work at the John Hunter Children's Hospital. I'm also the paediatrician in the specialised intellectual disability health team for the Hunter, New England and Central Coast regions. And I think that's probably why I got the ADHD plus bit, so that we can talk all things about disability, disadvantage, etc. And again, I thank Saren for these amazing slides. So ADHD impacts on so many aspects of the life of the child and the family, and impacts function at every level. We know too well about its impacts, and we've been talking about impacts on academic performance, and we should also consider the impacts on a child's sense of self, her efficacy, and the way that it impacts on peer relationships as well. Children with ADHD can get habituated to being told off every day in class, to not being able to finish tasks and feeling dumb. They end up with very low self-esteem, and it's very hard to talk a child who's been experiencing that out of those feelings without doing something substantial to improve the success that they're feeling. It becomes so hard to sustain attention to difficult challenges that these kids often just get into a learned helplessness or giving up sort of modality. And they often find that, you know, the bit that they used to be really good at, which was making other kids laugh and keeping, you know, conversations and peer groups going, ends up being the source of another area of disadvantage where they're blowing up easily, they get triggered easily, and their peer relationships in that middle childhood end up being significantly damaged by untreated ADHD. I have to figure out which is... this slide shows not only causes but effects and a whole lot of the co-existing conditions. We know that ADHD, emotional dysregulation and learning difficulties are really common sequelae of poverty and adverse childhood experiences. The ACEs landmark study was run in 2 cohorts in America between 1995 and 1997. It included 17,000 people, and it demonstrates a huge number of adults who can reflect on their childhoods and reflect on the number of adverse childhood experiences that they experienced. Almost 2/3 of adults who were interviewed in these studies had experienced at least one, and more than 20% had experienced 3 or more adverse childhood experiences in their childhood. What we know is that there's a proportionate increase. The higher number of ACEs that you experience under the age of 18, the higher number of illness and complications in your adult lives. And this affects not just mental illness and suicide, it affects maternal illness and fetal death, it affects infections and chronic diseases, cancers, and the more kind of easy to link drugs and alcohol, mental health, low educational outcomes and lower income. Hunter New England, as you all know, has really high rates of disadvantage. We work in pockets of poverty much higher than I realised when I moved from Melbourne. We have high rates of domestic violence and high rates of out-of-home care amongst our children, much higher than the rest of the state. So I'm talking to you about the kids that are ADHD plus. They're not the sort of fairly straightforward Sallys of our universes who have fairly uncomplicated family lives, some clear evidence of ADHD and simple straightforward treatment that clearly causes a change in function. I'm talking to you about the kids that are really difficult to tease apart, who end up, if they go to a psychologist, with a list of diagnoses with every letter of the alphabet, but mostly D. So this slide shows the incidence of various comorbidities that we find in people living with ADHD. And it reminds us to always ask, and what else, for every child we see with ADHD. I would highlight on this slide that children with intellectual disability have ADHD in higher rates than the general population. I find it really important to discuss with the families and carers that sometimes shorter attention span, difficulty sustaining attention to things that are hard, difficulty with flexibility and being able to complete tasks can be due to intellectual disability, the disability in and of itself. But we must always think about whether there are enough comorbid features of ADHD to warrant diagnosis, and essentially these become trials, therapeutic trials of medicine. So couching the medication as a trial helps me to set a shared level of expectations about what we can expect from the trial. I am very clear when I begin ADHD medication in children, any child, that ADHD can't fix ODD. It absolutely will not fix it if my child doesn't feel part of my team and if their default position is no. Those things require wider input than medication. And I find it really interesting that Stephen said that most of the families he sees don't really want to start their kids on medication. And I think that might reflect a variation in the the socioeconomic status of the people who might go to a private practice and those who you see in the public health setting, because I can guarantee you that I feel under pressure to get out the pen and prescribe straight away for the vast majority of families who come to me saying, my kid's got ADHD. And I know that because my husband or my dad or my uncle or I or someone else had ADHD, and this is what it looks like in our family. So setting a shared goal of expectations about what it looks like, what my medicine can do, what my medicine, and I say mine, because then I can be the blame for if it works or if it doesn't work. And we can talk through what I expect out of a trial and what I expect it could do. And what I'm also asking them to think about, which is usually, I'll get there in a minute, but all the parenting supports. So we've talked about that, sorry, I've skipped ahead. Treating ADHD does not fix a learning disorder. It certainly has those beautiful benefits that Stephen's talking about in terms of classroom efficacy and how successful I feel in my classroom journey as a student, but there are things it cannot do. So if you go back to Sally, she has a specific learning disorder in reading. We've talked about that. She makes really good progress on Ritalin. The teacher identifies that she still needs the increased support around her reading skills, and she's still refusing to read out loud. A really nice example about reading and reading out loud, I think, is always at the very, very beginning to talk to families about the benefits of reading stories to children when they are babies. I remember Adam and I had this conversation when he had his first baby, and we talked about the fact that the number of books that a child hears before they start school is proportionate to how they go in the first few years of school. It all evens out in the end. Those are not long-term sustainable things, but how they feel successful in their kindergarten and their year one, and how they get off and to start with listening to and loving stories, to understanding a wider vocabulary than other children who are not exposed. So for me, every baby I see, the last minute ditch as they walk out the door is, don't forget to sing and read. So I talk about 1,000 books before you start kindy. So the second thing I wanted to say about reading is the beautiful evidence that comes about of getting children who are really not confident readers to read to someone else. A puppy dog, a cat, a baby, anything else, a goldfish in a tank. But actually reading to someone who they don't think is judging them can be the bridge to being a reader later on. And so ADHD medicine plus reading to your dog is a really good way of overcoming these things. So I have to confess that oppositional defiant disorder would have to be my least favourite diagnosis, label, scapegoat. That I ever see in any work I ever do. It's, I guess, the reason I found transitioning my work from disability to disadvantage when I moved from Melbourne to Newcastle. That's what I felt like I did. It's the bit I found most difficult. I personally understand the need for it. It is used as the currency for the Department of Education and Health to talk about children who will be eligible for at least some degree of Department of Education funding, whereas they will not take ADHD into consideration at all. And so whilst I don't like it, I have to use it. For me, it describes a default position of a child who's refusing, and I think that it's a really, really common experience for children who've had a lot of trauma in their lives. And so I took to writing oppositional defiant disorder in the context of childhood trauma as how I write ODD. My approach to oppositional defiant disorder is to identify the contributors and talk to the parent and child about how we be a team for each other. How am I a team for you tonight? How are you a team for me? How does that child join their parent and family team? How does that child join their class team? What is it that would be of benefit to them to be part of that team? And so when we can be a team, then we don't run into the default refusal anymore. It becomes less over time. I believe that it's essential to enlist family support services, though finding the way in with families around that is really, really difficult, because the minute I talk about family support services, they think I'm telling them they're a bad parent. So we talk about their child having a set of behaviours that are really challenging to deal with, harder than lots of other parents deal with. We talk about the ways in which their child is special, their family is different, and the supports could give them some tips and tricks that they'll then go away with and just incorporate into their family dynamics. I could talk about family dynamics, not about parenting. It's not a very successful run at the moment. So making sure that the child has lots of opportunities for fun, so sports and art and crafts, so using those government vouchers that are available at the moment, and over time trying very much to shift away from the oppositional defiant disorder diagnosis. I didn't even write any notes on this one. I think conduct disorder, we need to think about it all the time. We need to think about it in the context of past trauma. I guess most of the children who I think I've met who fit this diagnosis, I've usually had a remit or a reason to refer them to child and adolescent mental health services. So if they're being cruel to cats and violent, threatening people with knives, those are the tip of the iceberg things that will usually get a child over the line with child and adolescent mental health services, though I acknowledge how difficult that is. We've already talked, both in Chris and Stephen's presentations, about depression and anxiety. I think that we should just be really aware that coexisting mood disorders exist really commonly in our community. We know that it's all increased during the time of COVID. We seem to have an epidemic of very sad, very dislocated teenagers at the moment. And if you do have ADHD and treatment works, then maybe the mood will get better. But I have seen just a couple of cases where my stimulant medication has certainly seemed to unmask a whole lot of increase the severity of the underlying mood symptoms. I think the other thing that didn't come up in Stephen's that I wanted to just mention in terms of mood is that occasionally what we're seeing is children who then rush to marijuana, and there's a lot of kids using dope at the moment to, I don't know whether they think it's got some impact on their ADHD, but they start taking that instead of the stimulant medication, and then we end up with kids who go really downhill with mood and anxiety, lack of motivation that makes the ADHD symptoms much, much worse because they're very ineffective at that point. But I think we should probably just think really carefully about the impact of drug and alcohol exposure. There's a whole nother talk that would be really interesting to get Krista to do about the vaping and about, GP's experience of the rapid rise of vaping and cigarettes and things at the moment. I've never seen a child who has had bipolar affective disorder that I think is bipolar affective disorder. Certainly seen lots of families who think their child might have bipolar because they've got that sort of dysthymia and swinging that in adult land seems to be getting more and more of a Guernsey of a diagnosis of bipolar these days. But it is a theoretical risk that some of our children, particularly in their late teenage years, will have symptoms of alternating depression and mania. I guess these percentages really reflect adults, but we should think about them as they become close to adults. And as always, whenever we're seeing a kid in outpatients and we're sort of flat to the chat and trying to figure out when we're going to see them again, there's always a sibling that they want us to squeeze in at some time as well. So now Sally's got a little brother. There'll be more of them too. There'll be 2 or 3 others probably. So Timothy's now 5 years of age and he can't sit still. He's a whirlwind, rough and tumble in the playground. and the usual, we are extremely sorry, but they can't get in to see us either. We are very sorry for the really horrendous availability of our paediatric services. I wanted to say while I've got the stage, it makes us not sleep at night knowing how many kids are on the waiting list and how few opportunities there are for new appointments each week. We continue to try and figure out ways of being more efficient ourselves, running more clinics. We have limited resources in lots of different ways, but we acknowledge that it makes it very difficult to do your best GPing and our best paediatricianing. So thanks. I'm going to hand over now to